China has just crossed an economic milestone that no country in modern history has ever reached. In just 11 months, China's trade surplus has surpassed $1 trillion. That means China exported more than $1 trillion worth of goods beyond what it imported. During a year defined by tariffs, trade wars, and constant claims that China's economy is slowing down, this happened despite aggressive US tariffs under President Trump and growing pressure from Europe. So the obvious question is not whether something extraordinary is happening, but what is actually driving it. And the most common explanation offered is simple. China's currency must be weak, undervalued, and manipulated. This discussion is based on articles that I will link below. When people say that the renminbi is weak, they usually mean that $1 buys a lot of it. Right now, roughly $1 buys about 7 renminbi, and €1 buys even more. At first glance, that makes Chinese exports look cheap and foreign exports look expensive. From this perspective, it seems logical to say that if China simply allowed its currency to rise, global trade would rebalance and foreign manufacturers would become competitive again. But that logic breaks down almost immediately once you compare China to other major economies. Take Japan, for example. $1 currently buys around 150 Japanese yen. That does not mean Japan is poor, dysfunctional, or cheating. In fact, Japanese policymakers have spent years trying to stop the yen from falling too fast because of how important exports are to their economy. The same is true for South Korea, where $1 buys more than 1,000 won. South Korea frequently intervenes in currency markets to protect its exporters. Switzerland, meanwhile, has such a strong currency that its central bank actively weakens it to protect domestic industries. Even the United States influences its currency constantly through Federal Reserve interest rate decisions that move global capital flows overnight. The reality is that no major economy has a truly free-floating currency in practice. China operates under what is called a managed float. The government sets a daily reference rate, but the currency still moves in response to market forces like trade flows, inflation, capital controls, and economic growth. This means that the renminbi is neither purely controlled nor purely free. It exists somewhere in between, just like most major currencies. What makes China different is not that it manages its currency, but that its economic structure creates constant downward pressure on it. China has a low inflation, weak domestic consumption, high household savings, capital controls that limit speculative inflows, and massive industrial capacity. All of these factors naturally push a currency lower. When economics or business leaders claim the renminbi is undervalued by 30% against the euro, they are assuming there is a single correct price that exists outside of economic structure. In reality, currency value is an outcome, not a setting. The renminbi reflects the way China's economy is built. This is where the trade surplus becomes crucial. China's $1 trillion surplus is not just large, it is historically unprecedented. It is larger relative to the size of the economy than the United States surplus after World War II, when much of the industrialized world was literally in ruins. And it happened during a period when tariffs were supposed to bring this dominance to an end. Exports to the United States fell sharply, but China adjusted by selling more to Europe, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Chinese firms also shifted final assembly to countries like Vietnam, Mexico, and Indonesia, allowing them to bypass tariffs while keeping core production inside China. This matters because it shows that China's export success is not driven solely by currency pricing. It is driven by supply chains, scale, logistics, technology, and cost control. Chinese manufacturers are no longer just producing cheap goods. They are producing electric vehicles, solar panels, consumer electronics, and industrial machinery that directly compete with Germany, Japan, and South Korea. Blaming the renminbi for this shift is easier than admitting that China has moved up the value chain faster than expected. Europe, in particular, feels this pressure intensely. China now sells more than twice as much to the European Union as it buys. European manufacturers face higher energy costs, tighter regulations, fragmented markets, and slower productivity growth. Even European business leaders admit that deregulation and energy reform alone may not be enough to close the gap. In that context, the renminbi becomes a convenient target. If Chinese success can be explained by currency distortion, then Europe's industrial decline does not need to be confronted directly. From China's perspective, allowing the renminbi to rise sharply would carry serious risks. A stronger currency would reduce exporter profits, threaten millions of manufacturing jobs, and accelerate factory closure in regions that still depend heavily on industrial production. Yes, imports like fuel, luxury goods, and foreign consumer products would become cheaper, and Chinese households would benefit. But no government, Western or otherwise, willingly chooses mass unemployment as a policy tool. China's leadership has been clear that economic rebalancing toward consumption must happen gradually, not through sudden shocks. There is also a global dimension to this trade, surplus that often goes unspoken. China's export earnings finance its technological investments, infrastructure projects, and geopolitical partnerships. They give Beijing leverage in areas like rare earth minerals, clean energy, supply chains, and development finance. This is not simply an economic outcome, it is a strategic one. That is why China is so resistant to trade barriers and so vocal in opposing protectionism. From Beijing's point of view, the current system is working. So is the renminbi undervalued? In my view, the answer is more nuanced than yes or no. The renminbi is cheap relative to Western currencies, but that cheapness reflects China's economic structure more than deliberate manipulation. Market forces matter far more than headlines suggest. If the currency were truly mispriced on a massive scale, China would be facing runaway inflation, capital flight, or financial instability. None of that is happening. Instead, China is producing what the world continues to buy at prices others struggle to match. The uncomfortable truth here is that global consumers vote every day with their wallets. If Chinese goods were not competitive in quality, reliability, and price, they would not dominate global markets. Tariffs did not eliminate demand. They simply changed the routes goods take to reach the consumers. Blaming the renminbi avoids a harder conversation about industrial policy, competitiveness, and long-term economic strategy in the West. In the end, the real question is not whether China's currency is weak. The real question is why China can produce so much of what the world still wants, even under pressure. The renminbi did not create that reality, it reflects it. And until that deeper issue is addressed, currency debates will continue to miss the point.